Reactive training systems.
Welcome back to the RTS podcast. I'm Coach Mike, and today I'm going to be joined by Coach Kenny, and we'll be talking to Pat Horvath. Pat has been a powerlifting coach, full-time powerlifting coach, as the guy behind Sticky Training Systems for over 3 years. He's also a pro untested lifter and holds the junior 110 deadlift record at 410.5. So think about that for a second, 410 kilo deadlift at 110. He's also game day coached at multiple pro level meets, tons and tons of times. And that's really where I met Pat. We started chatting at some competitions. The thing that coaches do is to talk shop about training. And Coach Kenny knows Pat fairly well. They also incidentally talk shop. And there were some interesting conversations that came about. And I think that's fundamentally what these podcasts are for, right? It's to explore different ideas. Different coaches have different ways of seeing things, and we wanted to bring that in here. So Pat is a guy who has coached at a high level. He had done a lot in the sport already. And he's got some interesting ideas and things that I think are worth taking seriously. So wanted to have a conversation with him, compare some notes. We'll just kind of do the shop talk thing, but do it on the podcast. So without any further delay, here's our conversation with Coach Pat. I guess part of why we're here, Pat, is to talk about your hot takes, man.
I have some good ones. I like to just say takes. Yeah.
No, I don't know, I guess standard sort of groundwork that probably we're all on the same page on and probably goes without saying. It's just that it's good to, discuss ideas with people that, see things differently. And, I kind of agree with what you're saying, but, not always, because I have this other perspective. Like that sort of thing is really good for growth. I mean, that's really essential for coaching development. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I think that's super important too. Like Eric Helms talks a lot about kind of the siloing that can happen as you grow in anything really, but especially like in coaching, where you start to build up your brand and develop your reputation, and you become more of this known quantity. So you tend to attract people who already know what they're getting into, that already kind of have this viewpoint of what you're all about. And you can, the phrase that comes to mind for me is you end up like just smelling your own farts all the time, because, you're solving problems that your tools are really good at solving, because that's the problems that you see. And it's a selection bias, but that's not what I want out of coaching either. Like I want to actually be good at coaching. So it takes a little intentional effort to like find, you got to go looking for edge cases it's not even edge cases. It's just cases where your normal tool set maybe isn't ready-made for those situations. So,
Right.
Anyway, that's a lot of preamble, but I figured I'll just kind of get that out of the way up front as far as like a reason why we decided to do this to begin with. And like from talking to Kenny, I think there's a lot of, like Kenny mentioned some things, some potential topics of discussion. I was like, oh yeah, that sounds interesting. Like it sounds like a thing where we may like see things a little bit differently, but like I'm not super married to the way that I see the world on X topic. So Kenny, save me.
One of the topics that I had mentioned was work capacity and how we might approach solving that sort of like problem or that bottleneck differently, where if a lifter has limited capacity for recovery or limited tolerance of training or parts of training, how would we approach that? And I think it could just be like neat or most informative to just like let Pat, if you want, talk about like what you would do in that sort of situation. and then we can kind of compare.
Yeah, so I think the biggest question when it comes to the work capacity thing, and the biggest thing that we almost came to disagreement on is, does work capacity even need to improve? Like, why do you want more work capacity? Because, like, we're assuming in a bottleneck situation, the lifter is not making progress that they want to make. So you've got to, work through the issues of like, okay, well, like, is it technique? Is it frequency? Is it like intensity and all of that? But there's going to come a point where you kind of nailed everything you can, and you just need to get the lifter to do more. Like, you just need more muscle on their frame, or just more reps throughout the week to just give more stimulus. And then the question is then from there, okay, well, where do we put it? And for me, with my own beliefs in my training, what I found is that typically the best place for me to start, and what I always like to try to do, is give it on I start increasing the lowest impact work first. So, like, for example, on a bench press, like for a lifter, like we just need more volume, more muscle mass. Like, I'm very hesitant to want to add much to their bench pressing, where I will much sooner add like tricep extensions, pec flies, or like delt raises first to try and just like build tissue. And from there be like, okay, like, is this enough? Are we seeing progress? If not, maybe, okay, let's stop doing like these like supplementary, like tertiary type exercises. Let's move to more of like a secondary one where it's like, okay, no, we need to actually start pushing like JM presses, or, like heavy skull crushers or something like that. Then building it up from like a base up perspective till we get to like, okay, like that wasn't enough. Now we need to increase like back down volume. Okay, now we need to start increasing like top sets. Like, we need to do 2 top sets per session instead of 1, etc. That was my main, that's just like the baseline of my work capacity, views, and like how to build it and like where to go from there. Reason is for that is, number one, the lowest intensity stuff, like the single joint isolation stuff, is just going to beat people up less. So it's just the safest bet. Like, I know a lifter can handle more tricep extensions. It's pretty easy to recover from those. And also, it just leaves a room for like more later. Like, the really heavy, stuff, like just like actually competition bench pressing more, those have the most like stimulus on them. They absolutely do. So if you pull those cards earlier, there's something that you can't pull later. You know what I mean? Like, there's only so much somebody can tolerate. You're never going to get somebody to 60 sets of benching a week. So like, if their lifetime limit is going to be like 30, pushing them from 20 to 30 now might mean 4 years down the road you don't have a weapon that you wanted to have. Yeah, I think that's just the very broad basic view of my work capacity theory. Yeah. I guess from there, if you could kind of remind me, Kenny, what was the differences that you had? And what would we discuss there?
We were pretty similar, I think, on just the general idea that, like, yes, like aim for the low impact stuff first, or right. If a lifter is at twice a week a benching or something, maybe you can look to sneak in like a third bench session or something somewhere, and maybe that is just better tolerated if they right. If that frequency is limiting their work capacity or how much they can tolerate. Sure. And I think maybe the main difference was where to like go from there, where like you it sounds like, so correct me if I'm wrong, sounds like you'd add a lot of these kind of more accessory movements, these isolation type movements, and then just sort of keep them there, and might not necessarily try to go to barbell movements as sort of the next step. In some cases, I would absolutely do that. Like, there's sometimes you just shouldn't add more that might be truly unwise, either in terms of recovery, injury history, or anything for the lifter. In some cases, we might, or I've done blocks targeted at building work capacity, doing maybe time-limited rests, or a timed AMRAP. You have to accumulate a certain amount of work in a certain amount of time, or circuit training, where it's like you're going to bounce between these exercises for a certain period of time. And this is done to hopefully globally bring up your ability to tolerate work. And maybe the next block could have 10% additional stress, additional workload, and wouldn't necessarily have to be in the form of these smaller, more isolated movements. So I think that was maybe the main difference, but I defer to Mike on energy systems. I know that you've done a lot of work with that type of training.
Yeah, I think it might be a good idea to kind of give you guys at least my working definition for work capacity. Usually, I find it as a term that it sounds like we're all kind of on the same page, but I know that other people sometimes mean slightly different things. So the way I would define work capacity is the amount of work that you're tolerating, the amount of work that you can recover from. So if you look at like a long-term baseline, like what's your baseline level of workload over like the last 3 months, that's something like your work capacity, because you can't really exceed your ability to recover for long periods of time like that. Like in an activity like powerlifting, you end up getting something that's breaking down, and that's not usually where you want to be. So yeah, that's kind of how I think of, like, that's how I would like calculate what your work capacity is. So when I think about bringing up somebody's work capacity, like what can we do to raise that baseline level of work that you're tolerating? And it kind of surprised me that, well, I guess I don't know how else you would do it. How else would you do it other than to add in some work that people tolerate well? Like old school Louis Simmons gets a lot of shit on the internet, but like that's kind of what he was talking about. Like it's funny because like back in the 90s and early 2000s, like they would talk about doing like these GPP workouts, and it was some kind of sled dragging and stuff like that. So people kind of equate these things. It's like, oh, you drag a sled and that equals GPP work. It equals increased work capacity. It's not that. It's that what he's trying to do is he's thinking, okay, if you drag a sled, there's no eccentric component to it. Therefore, it's easy to tolerate, easy to recover from. So you could add that in basically for free. Right. And so I guess like if you ended up in a situation where you just couldn't add in another set of tricep pushdowns, you just can't, you're at max, right? So maybe that would be an even more ginger thing for you to add in that's even easier to recover from, so you can just kind of eke it along. I don't know. I mean, I don't really find myself reaching for sled dragging. It's just not a thing that I have to reach for ever, but I can conceive of how you might, or why it might seem like a good idea, I guess.
Yeah. I think one of the more nuanced parts of like the work capacity discussion is also like why people are like coming to the work capacity bottlenecks that they get to. Because there's different like sort of variables in play. Like there's cardiovascular fitness. Like, is somebody not able to recover from more workload just because they cannot get nutrients to their like muscles? Like, are they not able to like pump the blood flow there? Like, so in that sort of situation, I think something like you said, Kenny, like reduce rest times and maybe just like literal direct cardio, stuff like that could be the thing you need to do. But there's also stuff like they can recover just fine set to set. Like their muscles are good to go, but maybe like their tendons and joints are getting really beat up, like, or something like that. Or like it could just be like they're literally just not like, they don't have the fuel for it. Like they just like get drained. Like they're like all of a sudden like they're like not recovering. They're not getting stronger such and such because they're at their volume limit. So I think pretty much you have to break down very specifically what is the work capacity bottleneck, because I think work capacity is a broad category of issues as well.
Totally. Yeah. Like I've been talking in the training lab more recently about, I've been thinking about training effects being in 3 broad categories: skill, structure, metabolism. Mm-hmm. And really this is like hits right on the metabolism idea. Like where do cells, muscle cells in particular, where does all this stuff get its energy? Where does cellular energy get derived from? So that, I mean, that includes nutrients, that includes, waste product, all that, so systemic energy production is a thing, and powerlifters tend to be bad at it. Not that, like, for a while there, it seemed like it got maybe, it wasn't ever really overhyped, but it's like there was like this sub-community within powerlifting that was like, oh yeah, you do need to do cardio because it helps you recover between sessions. And yeah, that's true. And most powerlifters don't take it seriously enough, but you also don't need to like really go in on this, like it's not something that drives your total up, but it can help a little bit. So like, yeah, like not being completely out of shape is probably useful,
That is, I have been, at least through Instagram, seeing a bit more of a swing in that direction, which of like the pro like cardiovascular fitness and stuff, which I am all about. Notably seeing just everyone on earth posting their daily average step count and stuff like that. I think it was mostly like, I think Rondell Hunt has been one of the biggest like guys just like posting it. Now everyone's like, oh, I got to like get my 10,000 steps in. So credit to him and whoever else has been pushing it. But do you find any other like specific types of like, you know, metabolic fitness to be that useful beyond just like a total movement throughout the day via step count and stuff like that? Like, do you think there's any other specific metrics like hit, like recovery of hit cardio or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what we need it to do, right? Like Kenny alluded to some like rest interval controlled training. And I would do that if I had somebody who wasn't recovering very well. Set to set workouts are just taking a really long time. You know, we can't get in the amount of work we need to do because we're just kind of out of shape. I would say systemic is part of that. And then also like this metabolic efficiency is part of it too. It's just kind of the spectrum, right? Of like, what's your energy production rate? You know, calories per minute, or I'm sure there's some essential metric for it, but you know, step count is one of them. It's like a really low intensity energy production, right? But then it ramps up. So that would be one of them. But like from just a work capacity standpoint, if I had an athlete who I felt like just they need to do more work, but they're not able to do more work because they're just recovery bottlenecked, I would program a block that's aimed at developing their work capacity. But the way I would go about doing that, I would increase the frequency so that our sessions are smaller from session to session. I would choose protocols that are easy to tolerate, so generally lower RPEs that allows us to push volume and recover well from it. And I would pick exercises that are easy to recover from that don't cause a huge amount of soreness. And I would do a block like that lets me do a good amount of work, maybe even push that baseline up a little bit and still recover well and tolerate it well, so that overall baseline can come up and you know, we just acclimate to a higher overall level of work over the next couple of blocks.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. I think something notable to touch on though, because we keep mentioning like, oh, an athlete needs more work capacity, like they just can't recover. What does that look like? And like, what are you seeing when you see that somebody just can't recover enough? Because I think that's not something that's very obvious to most people of like, oh, this athlete just isn't progressing, or like, do they need more work capacity to progress?
Yeah, well, you set it up properly in the beginning, I think, when you said that we're talking about an athlete who's not progressing as fast as they would like.
Yeah.
Right. The next component there would be the not recovering piece. And more often than not, that tends to be like joint issues, not so much like muscular soreness. Powerlifters tend to not be limited by muscular soreness. It's usually joint stuff. So that's the other piece. I guess training time is some of it, but you know, motivation to train is some of it. You see these excess fatigue factors come into play, and it is conditional, right? Because if you've got somebody who's already spending a huge amount of time in the gym and already like seeing flagging motivation, maybe you got to question, is that the best strategy to make them do more, right?
Let's really burn this person out. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I guess those are all indicators of fatigue. And I mean, you're going to have a conversation anyway, right? Like
absolutely.
Anytime you do this, you're going to be like trying to generate that buy-in. So like it has to be kind of a joint conclusion that more is at least territory worth exploring.
Yeah. One of the things that I know I see when I'm like the most obvious, like, okay, you need more work capacity, like you need more recovery, especially in that topic of like set to set recovery, we'd be looking at like working out stuff like reduced rest times, or just like outside of training, doing interval training, like bike sprints or something like that. The one thing I look at is, especially on accessories, that I look at set to set performance, because there's about a standard, you know, performance drop you'd like to see between sets if you're training like some sort of reasonable intensity. Like if you're doing like sets of like 15 on leg press, your first set shouldn't be 15 and your second one be 9. Like we're probably hoping for something in the ballpark of like a, yeah.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, like the number I have found mostly through my own training, but also then watching my athletes, is about like a 10 to 15% drop in like reps between sets. Like that's what I would consider to be like healthy. Like, okay, we're fit. But if you're seeing like 30, like you're doing like a set of 20 and then it's a set of 14 and now we're at a set of 9, like with the same weight, all at the same RPE, that's something that's like the first thing I look at, because that's like the most direct, like, okay, like let's look at like your literal measurable recovery, not just how you feel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you there. And it is a reality for me that I've got big drop offs like that for lower body in particular. And I do know that my lower body work capacity is lower, upper body seems to be. So this is an interesting thing too. It's kind of tangentially related to this.
Yeah.
My upper body work capacity is higher, meaning I don't see that kind of set to set performance degradation.
Yeah.
In the old days, I would have called that like a fatigue percent, like you can measure it, right? And I also find that making progress in a lift where it's really difficult to get that set to set performance degradation is more difficult. So like my bench press has really stable performance and it's really difficult to get it to improve. But lower body lifts seem to be more responsive to training generally, even though suffer more as a result of training volume.
Yeah, I mean, it's an indicator of sensitivity to it, be it good or bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
For sure, yeah.
Do you guys think that there are situations where we'd want to go the opposite direction and worsen someone's work capacity? Is that a consideration that you would ever make for someone's bench press like yours, Mike, where you like are so adapted to it that you can't go up, and so then can you make it go down so that you can start to climb again?
I did last summer, I believe. Yeah, like I was getting to the point where I was training just a ridiculous amount of bench. It was something like, gosh, I don't know, I don't remember, but it would be like an hour to 2 hour sessions just for bench, like 5 days a week. And then like 30 minutes of lower body training 3 times a week. The disparity was enormous. And it got to the point where I did a competition and had kind of a standard middling performance. And it was like, look, I can't imagine doing more than this. And I don't think that is the right answer. So I did do a period of training where it was like intentionally trying to let that baseline workload come back down. But also not just free fall my strength while I was in that period. So I had, I want to say, a month to 6 weeks where I did no benching. I did some isolation stuff. I did some like non-horizontal pressing. I think I did dips and I did maybe overhead press or something like that. So like still getting a little bit of training for the muscles, but overall the workload was, I want to say, like 30 to 40% of the baseline. So it was like way low, I did that for like a month or 6 weeks. And yeah, strength drops during that period, but it did come back fairly quickly once I got into normal training. It didn't require the same amount of work. And even now, like I'm not doing the same amount of work I was doing a year ago. And like I got to where I set some all-time rep PRs, which to me is a big deal. Like at 26, 27 years training age, setting some 5-rep PRs and stuff like that is a big deal. And the singles were quite good, even if they weren't like quite at all-time best levels, but I was doing that on probably a little more than half, maybe 3/4 of the workload that I had been doing prior to that. So that was a good sign to me.
I've got 2 questions on that front for that little anecdote. Yeah. Number one, how long did it take for you to get back to that point of like equal performance?
I'd say 2 to 3 months.
So that's pretty manageable. Like if you have like 6 month prep, like essentially you'd be looking at like, okay, we could take 4 months
Yeah.
out of it to call that like a refreshing 4 months, then we get 2 months of actually making progress on top of it. Like
Yeah.
that's reasonable within a competitive time frame actually. It's less time than I would expect to be here. For two, did you do anything outside of just changing work capacity, like the workload in training? Like, was there any changes to like nutrition or body weight or cardio or anything like that?
Body weight and cardio were roughly the same. I mean, it's always in a pretty tight range for me. I'm sure I was trying some different stuff training wise. I don't recall exactly what it was. It may have been some eccentric overloading, perhaps.
Okay.
But I mean, I'm always implementing some weird idea thought of from a actual training stimulus standpoint.
Yeah.
My perception is that it's more likely the workload than it is like this one weird trick.
Yeah. Just a thought I have, just like while talking about it, about like, being able to change work capacity, like stuff like that is what variables increase or decrease work capacity, and could you change them to affect it? And the number one I think of is calories eaten. Like how many calories are you eating during a day? So like if you need your work capacity to go up or down, are you going to be able to change how much food you're eating? Because that is something you could also do. Like you could have like if you need to like reduce your baseline metabolism because you think you need your body more sensitive to nutrients, but like you can't eat any more food. Like could you do like an extended period of like really low calories to drop your maintenance by 500? Maybe get you sensitive to nutrients and like raise the work capacity or something like that.
It'd be interesting to see what that would do to body weight too.
Right, because that's the question is like, all right, well, like, are you going to accidentally drop a weight class or go up a weight class in the process? Yeah, like that's another thing is that I think a lot of people within powerlifting tend to underplay is like calories. Like calories just play a huge role in recovery and how much you can do. And it is something you can change.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. Like the image that comes to my mind is like a big cargo net, right? And you have all these different spots on the net that might represent different things. Like one, in this case, could be calories. And you can pull on that one spot of the net and it moves all the other connected spots of the net too, which is all, and they all change in different ways, And I mean, that's just the reality of trying to make this biological system do what we want.
Right.
It's got its own ideas.
We're trying to reduce it down to like 10 different independent variables when it's way more than that. They're all very dependent on each other. Yeah.
That's a good point about calories, though. I hadn't thought of it.
Yeah. I mean, I've had some success with myself, mostly in the direction of reducing calories. Although we are not talking about timeframes of like 2 months. I was for a while on maintenance calories of about 6,000, which was just unbearable. Like if I ever wanted to like go up in weight, it would usually result me in going down because the second I added more food, I would just be in such shambles that I couldn't eat anymore. So there have been several times where I took like, I was like, all right, for the next month, I'm going to eat like 2,500 calories, which is less than half of my maintenance at the time. And like, my God, performance drops during those like, months. But like, I'm now sitting at reasonably similar body weights with the maintenance calories of about like 1,000 less, doing a little bit less workload than I was back then, but still making progress. So it's like, okay, well, like you have now excavated, like I've made some more room to grow. Because like, I guess I could get those calories back up and the workload would rise with it, but so the weight on the bar by then. The time frame we're talking for this, we're talking like years. Like, it's been like an ongoing process over the last about 2.5 years, but it has worked.
Did you see like a big drop in body weight when you do that? I mean, you have to see it in the short term, right?
So I'll see huge drops in body weight, but it's always when you go into like extreme calorie deficits, like beyond like 500 to 1,000. I feel like at least most of what I'm watching is loss of glycogen. Like the biggest cut I ever did was I made his calories roughly around 6,000. And by the end of it, I was down to just over 2,000. And over the course of 5 weeks, I had lost a little over 30 pounds. But that's just not possible to happen tissue-wise. Like so much of that was just all of the storage from my muscles, like depleting. So like, yeah,
it came back pretty quickly.
What was that?
It came back pretty quickly.
Relatively, like we're talking over the course of like a couple months.
Yeah, I gained 30 pounds back in the next 3 days. Couldn't be that, but
Yeah, no, like,
Next
Chris,
couple months is reasonable.
yeah, a couple months, and we would also be seeing then weight gain disproportionate to the caloric surplus we were expecting. Like, I'm expecting to gain a pound a week, and now I'm gaining 3. It's because I think most of it was just like fuel stuff, like glycogen, just like restoring and stuff like that. But yeah, the performance drops during those times were insane. Like, we're talking like estimated 1 rep max is dropping by over 10%, then coming back, roughly.
I mean, that matches up, right? Like bodybuilders in the last stages of contest prep see similar types of performance loss and things like
Absolutely,
that too.
yeah. Yeah. And also there's always the talk of injury risks in like massive deficits and stuff like that.
Totally.
Because a lot of it is, just like literal leverage is changing. Like, you lose all those glycogen, you now have to squat in a different fashion because your stomach doesn't touch your legs anymore. So now you don't know how to brace and you're out of position and stuff like that. So I think for powerlifting, that's a extreme strategy reserved for extreme cases. Not something you're going to see like every lifter do.
Totally. But 6,000 calorie maintenance is probably one of those extreme cases.
Yeah. But in like, in proportional doses for proportional lifters, like you see someone with like, all right, you're kind of at your end of like reasonable work capacity. Like, you're clearly recovering from everything, but we need to do more. And just like your tendons aren't able to handle it, or like we just don't have the time in the week to do this much work or something like that. That's when I think it might be appropriate to try and do some sort of reduction of work capacity to then build it back up.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it's not a unique thought. I mean, it is to this particular case, I guess, but it's not a unique thought of just the thing of like, okay, let's build something up, pull back a bit. We're going to lose some of it, but not all of it, and then build up again, just like cutting and bulking and stuff like that.
Right.
Just standard like peaking strength, everything. It's pretty it's standard for it to be successful, I think, in fitness, to have that like sort of like cyclic nature of like rise in performance, drop most of it, but not all of it, build it back up just over and over again.
Yeah.
Taking the net wins and letting them stack.
I've got a client now who, we kind of do these bulking cutting cycles. Like it's just kind of part of supporting the training nutritionally. I think the standard practice would be when you get to one of the cutting cycles that you do like smaller changes, right?
Yeah.
Outside of like a situation you're describing, it's like, okay, slight surplus for bulking, slight deficit for cutting, and so on. We're oscillating in that pretty tight range. But for whatever reason, for him, like that slight deficit just wrecks his performance. These are human bodies are so weird sometimes, but like that slight deficit wrecks his performance. So originally we noticed that and we're like, well, let's try to do like an aggro cut and just get it over with, Yeah. And so we did, and that didn't seem to wreck his performance. So it's like, man, this is...
Did it wreck it proportionally or like...
No, it was like not as bad as the subtle cut. Like subtle cut was horrible. Aggro cut was like not great, but not as bad as the subtle cut,
How long were each of those cuts?
About a training block. So 4 or 5 weeks is kind of what I was doing for like a subtle cut, and it would just wreck that block. And then it became like, well, what if we just cut more aggressively and we do it for like 2 weeks?
That's what I was going to ask, is because like, were you seeing sort of thing where like, yeah, okay, you only did it in 2 weeks, you got the same amount of weight off, but like by that second week of the aggro cut, you were feeling just as bad as the second week of the subtle cut?
Yeah, I think I would say that's probably close. It just, like you see the performance start to dip a little bit, but by the time the performance starts to dip, the cut's over, Yeah. Whereas when it goes on for a month and a half, it's got a lot more time to deplete,
That is a strategy that I've very much agreed with, at least logically. I unfortunately not had too much time to try it because, at least with the powerlifters who I work with, which is mostly juniors, there just isn't too much of a interest in like diet manipulation. They seem to just be like, yeah, I weigh this much, like that's fine. I'm like, do you want to try and push it? And they're like, eh. Or I'll give them their macros. I'll check in on them in a month, and they're like, no, I haven't been eating them. And I'm like, okay, sweet.
Yeah.
But
It is another level of athlete that where you
Yeah,
can start playing with stuff like that.
at least for the ones that have been interested in it and have like followed through, and also just like what I've believed from what I've kind of made sense to me. Yeah, sort of like a mini cut style thing. I know it's like Mike Israetel in Renaissance Periodization. They talk about it a lot for the sake of bodybuilding. But like if you're trying to like, over the course of like, let's say you've got 16 weeks, you could do 12 weeks of bulking and 4 weeks of cutting and try and make it like even out like that. Or you could do 6 weeks of bulking, 2 weeks of a really hard mini cut, 6 weeks of bulking, 2 weeks of really hard mini cut. That way you only ever get 2 weeks into a deficit and you get to spend, 12 weeks filling out still. So it feels like the whole prep you were in a surplus, but you took 2 breaks to keep the body weight and metabolism where it needed to be.
I've thought about doing something that's so I've thought about this idea. I haven't implemented it because it's really kind of, if you took that idea like one step more extreme, which would be in maintenance or slight surplus during a development block. And then when you deload or you pivot, then run a deficit. Again, buy-in's hard to come by because even the people who are willing, and most people, when they start a deficit, it takes them a week, 2 weeks to just even start to meet the caloric deficit. Habits change slowly and stuff like that. So you really need somebody who's super locked in nutritionally, and then they've got to buy into that process. Yeah. And I haven't found anybody who's checking all those boxes, right? But it is kind of this idea that I've played with a little bit.
Hey, if Ronnie Coleman was a powerlifting coach, he might have said, everybody wants to build custom training programs, but nobody's got a process for how to do it on the regular. But we do. You see, most coaches rely on trial and error, and that's fine if that's your jam, but we wanted a coherent process. Way back in 2015, when I had already been coaching for over a decade, I finally had learned enough from enough sources that I was able to put the pieces together into one coherent process. We call it emerging strategies. The bulk of our 16 world record setting powerlifters set those records using an emerging strategies program. We talk about emerging strategies a ton on this podcast and everywhere. If you ever want a single thorough explanation for how to implement the emerging strategies process, well, that's the Emerging Strategies course. The Emerging Strategies course includes 8 modules. That's almost 24 hours of video instruction covering everything. We teach fundamental concepts and basics all the way through integrated examples and case studies. You can watch it at your own pace, as fast or as slow as you want. Oh, and the RTS community, our private community that offers you just a stupendous amount of value all on its own? Well, if you enroll in the Emerging Strategies course, you get 6 months of that community membership for free. If you have any questions about some concept, you just post it in the network or jump on a live office hour call with one of our RTS coaches and you get your answer. If you'd like to enroll or just learn more, to include seeing a full lesson list, all you have to do is go to reactivetrainingsystems.com and click on courses in the main menu. You're going to love it.
Yeah, the best clients I've ever had that do check those boxes are every single time the people that go from bodybuilding to powerlifting. Yeah. It's the bodybuilders love it, and I love them for it. But yeah, it's rare for most people who got into powerlifting as their first sport.
I don't think I could do that. I don't think I'm at that level where I could manage my nutrition that tightly.
I love it. It's beyond fun for me. It's like I think about nutrition more than powerlifting for my own training. Really? Because the training itself, it's like I've been doing the same thing for years now. Like I know exactly when to go into the gym, it's going to feel okay, and I'm going to go home. But for nutrition, there's challenges. There's new interesting things to play with because there's a lot more foods out there than there are exercises and stuff like that. But that thought you had of cycling nutrients according to the training stimulus, I very much have agreed with. I know it's very common, at least through a microcycle, to do it, but I don't see it as much through a mesocycle because it's very frequent for me to see people doing high carb days, low carb days, and stuff like that. All right, for your SCD day, you're going to pull 100 grams of carbs from your rest day to put it on there. Get that recovery where you need it, which just makes an astonishing amount of sense. Let's just recover more on the days where we're getting more beat up. The days where we're just sitting at home, you don't need it. But then, that's also something I've done program for athletes. Again, It's always a little bit questionable how much they follow it, because I think a lot of them just eat. And if they are following macros, they've just got the macros memorized. They're not like actually checking them every day. But I've definitely done stuff where I like pull 50 grams of carbs a day from their like week 1, put it on their week 4 sort of thing. And what I have always found from the ones that do follow through with it is that it only is noticeable in extreme and fringe cases. Like they're eating 1,800 calories a day sort of thing. Or I've had a few people in the opposite direction where they eat like close to 6,000 calories a day. And like they feel so like bloated and like bogged down and slow from their food, they will actually pull food away from their heavier sessions just to get them like feeling fresh and like, okay, I'm all right. Because there comes a point in food where like it doesn't matter if on paper you're in a deficit, you're still fat. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's something I've agreed with and have played with. I've seen good results from it. Within the powerlifting community, I just don't think there's enough intentionality towards it to get a great answer yet, or at least not for me.
Yeah.
One of the other topics that we had wanted to explore, Pat, you and I had a conversation about like, what does it mean to have radically individualized training as opposed to just individualized training? Because like, what does that mean? And like, is it something that should be done from the very, very start, or should we try to use something that is a little bit more typical, like fit people into kind of like maybe these demographics and apply a program that is likely to work for them, and then try to make iterative changes based on what their data suggests? And I think you were more in kind of the second description, where it's like, I'm going to put people into these groups and then we'll see what we can do. And that honestly isn't too dissimilar to how I would approach it. It just maybe like a little bit more integration of what they've done previously and really trying to kind of look at that for clues to maybe start with something that's a little bit weirder than they would otherwise just get from something more typical. What do you think?
I think a lot of things for this topic. So I think we're definitely going to come to the end agreement that programming needs to be individualized. Like, of course, like you can't just give people template programs. And it's going to end up extremely individualized at the end of the day. But when I think about it almost like gamifying it in the sense of your skill as a coach. Like, how good of a coach can you end up being? And like, let's say you're someone who works with 40 different athletes. I just don't think that, at least for most human brains, you can have 40 different systems. I think there's just a limit to how many different systems you can master. And I don't think it's the amount of athletes that the coach can work with. You know what I mean? I think it's fewer than that. So I think the best strategy to become the best at programming for athletes, to get them to make the most progress, is to essentially treat individualization as a fallback. So like, you can't start everybody on the same template, because we know there's going to be greater individualizations. If I give a 140 kilo man or a 56 kilo woman, I'm not giving them the same program to start with. There's no point in even wasting time. But like, if I can start people on a program that I know I can work well with people on, I'm going to start with that and only make adjustments if needed. For example, within my own programming, I am extremely prone to giving people squatting and deadlifting on the same days. So if they squat and deadlift twice a week each, they have 2 lower body sessions. They have a primary squat, secondary deadlift, and a primary deadlift, secondary squat day. I very rarely break those up unless I'm absolutely forced to, because I've just gotten good at working with people hitting both lifts on the same session. Like, I've just understood, like, okay, like, these are the situations where we need a deadlift first, squat second, or like make the squats lighter, or like do more accessories instead of less compound work and stuff like that. So I think from the aspect of being like, okay, how well can I understand how to program for people? It is better to just kind of learn your system and then make the tweaks that you must make about that system to each athlete to make it work for them, than it is to try and be like, okay, here's the athlete, let's try and figure out everything they need from the ground up. Just for the sole reason of, I think there is a limit to how much somebody can understand, and you're going to be better at executing with fewer systems in your head than more systems, if that makes sense.
So is system, when you say it, so to me, like system means like emerging strategies where it is this idea of like, okay, I'm going to look at the athlete, integrate their past, examine their data, integrate their feedback as well, and then try to keep applying this and keep learning from it. That to me is like a system. But when you say system, it sounds maybe more like a skeleton of a program where it is these like, so what did you say, primary squat and secondary deadlift and primary deadlift and secondary squat on these different days. And that works for a lot of people, but you use a different like system, or it's a different kind of like layout for a different lifter. Am I interpreting that correct?
Yes. So essentially, like, yeah, like systems is in like emerging strategies, like that would be a more broad system. I'm talking like, what I mean is like very specific, like almost templates for each athlete. Like, okay, like I know really well how to use this split. So like if I can fit an athlete on this split, like this exact like, layout of frequencies, I can, because I know really well when I see something happening on their tertiary bench day, I need to make this adjustment on the secondary day because I've already seen it in 8 other athletes. Like I think that's the main benefit is when you have people on more similar programs, albeit not, not clone, but more similar programs, you're going to see patterns across them more easily than if you have everybody on much more radically individualized programs. It's just more difficult to notice patterns across them.
I mean, I suppose I think I'm willing to take your word for it on that. That would not be an observation that, I would have firsthand experience with. I mean, we do end up putting people on, there's elements that are similar, right? And you could almost think of it like, building with Legos, and these are the different training schedules that you can have for a given week. And, some people, there's still a good number of them, but it is a finite number, and you generally have some of these as a starting point and then you deviate from that. But then there's so many other elements, right? That there's some strategies really emphasize increasing submaximal volume. Others really emphasize frequency. Others utilize higher RPEs and maybe a lower frequency. And some really emphasize accessory movements and all these different strategies for getting stronger. I mean, what I hear you saying is that there will be subtle signals for each of those that you may not pick up on because you're not fully immersed into any one of those strategies, that you have a more broad familiarity with a wider range.
Yeah, it's on the side of the spectrum of like you should try not to be a jack of all trades, master of none sort of thing. Like I think and just to become a better programmer, it's probably a good starting point to try to be a master of one than a jack of all trades. Like want to at least start out being like, okay, I'm going to be the guy that really knows how to increase people's squats by getting really good at like their accessory programming. Like I'm going to figure out how to get their legs jacked sort of thing. And then figure out frequency instead of just being like, okay, well, this one athlete, I'm going to mess with their frequency. This one athlete, I'm going to mess with their accessories and stuff like that until you are to a point as a coach where you feel like you've, mastered each aspect. Now, I guess I'm maybe not talking about them in the sense of like, okay, well, like you should take dedicated periods of time where you don't ever mess with your lifters' frequencies because like there's going to be times where they need that and stuff like that. It's just a matter of like the mentality of what do you prioritize within like your own skill development. And I think being unintentional about what aspects of like programming are individualized is going to lead to a slower development of like coaching skills than it could otherwise. That's the main thing I'm talking about here is just the development of coaching skills, and trying to individualize too much across too many athletes will delay the development of them.
I think I haven't thought about this with a lot of detail, so
Sure.
we may find out that some of these ideas need some refinement. But
Absolutely.
I think, one of the ways I've tried to deal with some of this is kind of the development of some superseding ideas. Like I see something similar. My kids are up from their nap, so they're going to come down here and interrupt me in about 4 seconds.
Awesome.
Hold on. Hold that thought, I suppose.
Okay.
0% chance that worked, by the way. Be like, hey, go back upstairs and lay down. Yeah, that won't work. Oh, anyway, where was I? So, yeah, like the development of like some of these superseding ideas. Like, I see people who are reluctant to make significant changes to their program from micro to micro, or not from micro to micro, but from block to block. They feel like you need to figure out what volume and intensity somebody responds to, and then just stay real tight to that as you go from one block to the next. And I don't agree with that at all, but I see why you may think that, not you, Pat, but just like I see why a coach may think that if you didn't have a framework for adjusting training volume, let's say, through wide swings in intensity and wide swings in frequency, yeah, it's going to be real tough to get the workload just right.
Right.
But that's one thing, like I feel like stress index helps with immensely is, you know, I can make big changes to frequency and pretty much nail the workload. You know, I can make changes to exercise selection and pretty much nail the workload. I don't feel like I've got to find it and just stick real tight to it. I can implement some wider changes and not feel like it takes me 3 blocks to really get the variables dialed in, you know?
Yeah.
I think some stuff like that tends to help, you know? I don't know. What do you think?
Definitely. And that kind of comes back to the point I was saying where it's like, it's about development, and the further into your coaching journey, the more experienced you are, the less development you're going to need to do, because you already developed a lot of these skills. And something like stress index, I think a lot of coaches will essentially build that on their own intuitively, or literally use your stress index system where they're essentially using your own experience. Like they're outsourcing the experience to somebody else to figure out like workload changes and stuff like that. Absolutely. And I do think people will be a little bit hesitant to change things if they don't feel like they have a full understanding of what's going on. And that can lead to reductions in progress, because oftentimes things need to be changed. They always need to be changed if progress isn't happening. It's kind of the definition of it. Like, yeah, you're not doing something right. Something's got to change then.
Do you, because I know that there's some coaches, like I'm thinking of a couple coaches I know that tend to be, I don't know if they know that they're like this or not, but they're pretty steeped in like a conjugate framework, but like that's their thing in their end, right? And for them, it's to the point where they'll have athletes who come to them and they're, you know, problem solving for this athlete. And they get to the point where they're like, you know, what you really need is not conjugate. You really need is this other thing entirely. I'm not the guy for that. You know, you need to go find a coach who is the guy for that.
Yeah.
Is that kind of where you sit with it as well?
There's going to be an extent of that I do kind of agree with, but I think the ones in that camp that, because I do know some of those like conjugate guys are like, they won't stop doing conjugate. What I think the ones that I agree with, my best example of this, because I really respect him as a coach, Stu Kodiak Barbell, he'll do this a lot. Where he says what he's doing is conjugate. He's like, I'm a conjugate coach. I like programming conjugate. And then he talks about his lifters, and it doesn't look anything like conjugate for some of them because they didn't need conjugate. Like he started them out with like a max effort, dynamic effort type system. And he's like, okay, well, the dynamic effort actually needs to be like higher reps in each set with a lower intensity. And then, we need like 3 sets of 8 instead of 8 sets of 3 sort of thing. He gets to that. And he's like, oh, well, they're going to need actually a tertiary day. And so then it's like, eventually it's like, okay, this just looks like a pretty standard, just to current periodization. Right. Like, so it's like, but because Stu is really good at, you know, working with his conjugate system, he still thinks of it as conjugate. It's still within his framework of what he knows, but he's made those developments to it where it doesn't even look like how it started, but it's still within his mental system. Like, that's the sort of thing I think I'm getting at here, where it's like he's a conjugate coach, and to him it still looks like conjugate. I think for a lot of people, they should be trying to be like, okay, well, like, if this is my framework that I'm really good at working with, I should be able to make adjustments to people's programs and still keep it within what feels like my framework, where I'm comfortable working with it and I understand everything that's going on. Like, if you just try something new at random just to try it, or just to be like, all right, like, this is maybe what some of the evidence is saying, let's just try it, but I have no experience with it, this is a completely new way of programming for me, you're likely not to do as good of a job, because you're not going to have any sort of patterns built up in your head already of what to look for.
Oh yeah. I fully agree with that.
Yeah, like, the example for me would be like, if I just picked up a new athlete and I was talking about with my, like, having squats and deadlifts on the same day. If I was like, no, actually, we're going to have them just completely chopped up now. Like, if I was looking at, like, how someone's squat was feeling the day after they deadlifted, I'd be relatively confused as to what to do with it, because I have, like, off the top of my head, I think I have 2 athletes who did squat after a daily deadlift. So it's like, I've got so much less experience with that than the other, like, 38 athletes I have that squat and deadlift on the same day.
Yeah. Yeah, and you'd have to see, I think you could build up that context in a reasonable amount of time, though. You do start to develop this question of like, well, does that come at the expense of the athlete? And maybe it does, but it's also done intentionally to troubleshoot for them some problem that they were having too. So it's not just like purely done for your own education.
No, it shouldn't be. Like, that's what I was saying earlier. If you're making the conscious decision as a coach, like, I'm not going to change anyone's frequency for the next 6 months until I feel like I've really nailed accessory volume. Right. You're doing a disservice to your athletes. But it's not entirely on the end of like, you need to do every single thing according to the athlete, because if you're going to be the best coach for the athlete and you're going to get them the best results in the long run, you need to be the best coach you can be. And some of that involves you learning. And if you're going to put the athlete's program into a situation where you can no longer learn from it, I don't know if you're going to be doing as best job as you can for them if you're never figuring them out. Like, you might need to take 1 step backwards to take 2 steps forward. Yeah. I guess that's something I could get with as well, though. Like, it's not like, hey, to invoke the conjugate example again, just because it's an easy named example. Hey, I'm doing things, hey man, we only play 80s Joel, right? Yeah. We only play Billy Joel from the 80s. It's not quite like that. I only write programs using the templates that Louis provided in Powerlifting USA from 1999 to 2005. Like, no, nobody does that, right? Yeah. Like, you start with a framework, whatever your framework is, but then you continue to develop it. So, like, if you think of the cargo net example from earlier, but this time instead of a cargo net, let's use like a 3D map, and you're trying to get to some peak on the map. You can't learn the whole map. There's just too much. So you've got to learn your corner of the map, but you do want to broaden that corner as you're able to, and expand that. 100%. Yes. Yeah, that's, I think, the very moral of the story. And I knew we'd end up essentially agreeing, but
that's good.
Yeah. The general consensus is like, if you're trying to learn your map, learn it from your house outward. Yeah. Don't try and learn everything at once. Don't just start studying everything and just like picking random points. You're never going to figure it out like that unless you have a organized way that you're going to progress through it.
Right.
Because like, coaching is a skill. And this, you got to add tools to your tool belt. But if you just do them at random, it's going to be hard to keep the old ones. You know what I mean? You have to be using them to keep them. And if you're just trying different things all the time, that means you're probably neglecting some of the other tools you use.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good way to think of it.
Yeah. If we have time, I did actually have a question I was pondering about on a walk earlier that I think you'd be one of the best people in the industry to ask about. Mike, I've seen a lot of pendulum swings starting to happen in powerlifting. There's stuff where, people were really pushing it in like the equipped days especially. and it just didn't seem to work when done my way for raw. But then people in raw powerlifting went so far in the other direction that that's not working either, and we're swinging back. Some examples of this I've seen could be like the off season. Like, yeah, we don't need to have an off season where we're not touching anything over 75%. But that doesn't mean we should be hitting 97% plus every single block of the year. So my question for you is, do you see anything that you think we're kind of swinging back on pendulum-wise? Because you've got a lot of the experience throughout the actual transition of like equipped to raw.
So many things.
Yeah.
I've thought about like trying to write an article at some point and like list out the things, but like some of them are kind of silly things, like where to put your feet in the bench press. You know, like that was one. Like when I first came up, George Halbert was the man when it came to benching, and he benched with his feet like really far out in front of it. And then it was like the metal militia guys, and they had their feet like really far tucked underneath, you know. And then it's like gone back and forth a few different times. But ab work is another one. Like it used to be like, oh, of course, obviously you've got to train your abs, and you got to do it heavy. Like you got to do like weighted sit-ups and like all this stuff. Yeah. And then it's like, no, you don't have to do anything at all, anything except squat, bench, deadlift. That's it. Yeah. But now we're seeing people kind of, even some like die-hard, high specificity coaches that I know have come back and they're like, hey, I started programming ab work for so, and he noticed that like he felt like way more connected to the barbell, you know, like the whole system felt a lot more rigid and like he had a lot more control. Yeah. And then you start to see this kind of becoming a trend again, you know. Yeah. So
the Copenhagen planks and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff like that, but then like the accessories, I guess, has been another big one. That's been a little bit more long lasting, but I think the last time, like powerlifting seems to go through these infatuations with Bulgarian style weightlifting. Like how do we make Bulgarian training work for powerlifting? At least we went through several of these phases, right? And I think the last one would have been like 2010, 2012, got to be somewhere in there, you know.
So the Bulgarian system, just as a refresher for me, that is pretty much just like a really high frequency, high intensity type of system, right?
Yeah, like daily max out is kind of the meme version of it, right? Like how do I max out every day? And like, do you do back offs, or do you do like a real true max, or is it just like a training max? And like there's all these conversations around it. But then that would have been the last one I remember anyway, would have been like the early 20 teens, I guess. And that gave way to less like daily max out, but like high frequency, high volume, high specificity. It's like, hey, you're going to squat 3 days a week. You're going to bench 4 days a week and deadlift 2 days a week. We're not, you know, pause squat. Well, that's not really a squat. So that doesn't count. You know, it's got to be like competition style. Like, and that was like 2015, right? And then a bunch of people got really strong, but then got really hurt. And, you know, and then we're like, hey, maybe people actually need some accessories.
There needs to be some sort of variation in movement patterns. So it's not just carrying apart one single spot of a tendon.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then I tend to think like a lot of this stuff has to do with the life cycle of lifters too. You know, that there is a time where you can do stuff like that and you do get stronger doing stuff like that and you're probably going to be fine. Yeah. You know, but then that time ends and you have to do something else, you know.
Yeah. I think at least what I've seen from some of my local cohorts, Instagram stories and stuff like that, because there'll be like one lifter that does something that's a little bit different, but like kind of makes sense. And then everyone's like, oh God, we need to get back to this. Like, for example, like we see in like track and field for like throwing and stuff. Like, what does a throwing practice look like? You get out there and you throw your shot like 60 times. Your competition shot throw. You don't do any like sort of like, I mean, granted, you'll lift and stuff like that. But there isn't much like breaking down of it. You just do it because you can recover from that. It's a low enough impact, high enough velocity thing where you can do that. So people will be like, okay, well, what would be, in theory, the best possible powerlifting training? It'd be something similar to that, where we just do a bunch of SBD days, like 5 SBD days a week. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess in theory that would work. And then we see Agata Sitko go down from like, her 76 to 69, hit the 600 kilo total. This insane performance. And right afterwards, somebody asked her what was her split. And she was like squatting 4 days a week, deadlifting 4 days a week, and benching 7 days a week sort of thing. And then everyone's like, we need to go back. Like, we need to spam frequency. So I think it's usually like you see one person do it, like Agata, and everyone's like, okay, it worked with her. Like, we need to go.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, like it or not, like that's kind of how this stuff goes. Like, it's just that high performing athletes have a disproportionate influence on the course of the sport. And that's just
absolutely
how it is. I trained at a strongman gym in Wyoming for a little while. And the guy who ran it was like I don't actually know the level of strongman he was, but he's not like a world-class strongman competitor. And he's working mostly with like local strongman people. And through coaching and practicing and stuff like that, he came up with kind of a novel way of doing, I forget the movement exactly. It was like a keg load or something similar to that.
Yeah.
And, he was showing it to some people. And he's like, hey, like my kegs are way better when I do it like this, And some of the top coaches and stuff are like, no, I don't think so. Like, you're probably going to rupture your bicep if you do that or something like that. Nothing ever happens. He's just like way better doing it the way. And when he coaches his other people to do it that way, they're also better at it. Yeah. It's like, man, what you need is like one class person to do it that way, and it'll become the way.
Right. Yeah. Because you always, the issue is with like someone like Agata Sitko doing it like that. Or my most local example, the way John Hack trains with his like RP 9.5 single every single week. And then he just deloads when his last warm-up feels bad. I think a lot of it is like, yeah, this sounds like such perfect training because it is, but you're not the type of person that can recover from it unless you're like 1 in a million. Like the reason why Agata Sitko put up 600 kilos at 69 is because she's Agata and she can recover from taking an SPE day like 5 times a week. Like, yeah, you're right. On theory, you're like on paper, in theory, an SPE day 5 times a week is like really optimal training. And that's probably why she did so well. It's because she's like the 1 in a million that can actually train like that. Like a lot of these things that people will swing towards pendulum wise because like one really good lifter did it. It's because it in theory made sense. It's just the bottleneck is just genetics usually. It's not the theory that they did.
Sure. I mean, I think that has a lot to do with it. I would say too, like that becomes really useful fodder for your development. Yeah. So like you see Agata do what she does and you go, man, like the high frequency stuff kind of feels cool right now.
Yeah.
So maybe like learn a little bit more about that. Because like that's kind of what the way I always end up thinking about this is like if 5 years ago showed up on my doorstep, and we know at this point that like that kind of training works really well for her. Like, could I have figured that problem out? And I want to be able to answer yes to as many athletes as I can, whether it's John Hack and what he's doing or whether it's Agata and what she's doing. Right. Go like, man, you need a broad array of skills to be able to come up with that, So, I mean, it is a little bit, it's like program hopping from a coach's lens, I guess. It's like hey, this looks interesting, so I'm going to learn more about that, and kind of explore that space, get a little bit better at that, managing that variable.
I think another variable that goes into being able to do those like new styles of training at least, or like you just have to be like, you have to be the coach that has the balls to get one of your better athletes deadlifts 4 times a week. You know what I mean? Like, who's going to do that? Like, because I know if I was coaching Agata, I would never have told her to deadlift 4 times a week, just because I'd be like, I'm going to break my best athlete. Like, I can't do that.
That is a real thing. Like, I've talked about this a little bit before. When I felt it most pronounced was when I was coaching Brett Gibbs. Yeah. And we were doing some pretty counterintuitive stuff with his intensity. But again, it was just like, we're doing the things that he seems to respond really well to in training. But it's very much like, hey, if you do this and it blows up in your face, then everybody goes, what an idiot. Like, why did you think that was thing, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you just kind of follow the norm and it blows up in your face, you go, well, I did what I was supposed to do, you know? So
Yeah.
there is kind of a, I don't know, like it feels wrong to just slap a courage label on it, but it's kind of what it is, like from a social standpoint.
Yeah. Because I think that strategy right there comes down to being the exact opposite of the entire last rant I just had, where you're deciding to do something where it's like, okay, well, this is completely outside of the system I know works, which that has the 1 in 100 chance of working really well and then causing some grandiose, like, pendulum swing of, like, everyone's like, this guy's a genius. He tried the new thing. Let's go do that.
I mean, I wouldn't do that, you know, the last 2 blocks before Worlds, just, hey, I wonder what happens if we, you know, do the opposite. But like, I would say if when you've had time and you are troubleshooting and you're exploring and stuff like that, and you just kind of notice the pattern, once you've noticed that pattern, you gotta go with what you see, right? Like you notice, hey man, when I know that this is the way that I normally do things and the way that I peak people for competitions and the way that I know best. But whenever I have this guy do that thing, it blows up. But then we did this one weird thing just for a break and that seemed to work. You know, so now what? Now we got a meet coming up in 6 weeks. Now what do I do? Right.
Yeah.
Well, you got to go with the weird thing. And yeah, it fucking sucks in a way and it's uncomfortable for everybody. But, you know, what are you going to do? The thing that you expect to blow up? You know, you can't do that, right? But
no.
So, yeah, you've got to take that risk, I guess, but it is definitely uncomfortable.
It absolutely can be. I think those risks should probably come as the second option.
Yeah,
like just trying the new thing. That's like you got to
don't do it just to try something new. It's done to solve some problem along the way, and you learned kind of incidentally.
Yeah, no, that's the reason why a lot of people can't self-coach, is because when you're self-coaching, you're so willing to be like, yeah, let's try something new to try it, because you're willing to mess with your own training. Yeah. At least that was for me. Is I would try new things all the time back when I would self-coach.
Yeah, like, I do still.
Yeah, it's fun. It really is, because like you can sometimes learn some interesting things about yourself, but I think it long-term leads to just essentially program hopping, but with your own program.
Right.
The program hops around you instead of you hopping around to different programs.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that, like, I know I've gotten better at over the years, but yeah, it's a slow process. I think we've soaked up a good portion of your afternoon here.
I've got a little bit more if you've got any more topics, so otherwise I'm content. Yeah.
Yeah. Kenny, do you think of any other topics?
There was nothing that came to mind or that I wrote down initially. I think the conversation in general went in a lot of interesting places and definitely went deep down some kind of rabbit holes and connections. So I think that was exactly what it was intended to do. So that's perfect.
Good.
Kenny, the mastermind of the whole thing here. I appreciate you, man.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you guys having me on a lot. I had a good bit of fun.
It was good to compare notes like this. I think it's good overall. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, for sure. We can figure out the two most different routes possible to end up at the same place.
Exactly.
Yep.
It's a good time. Yeah. All right.
Hey, look, I've been a self-coached lifter for my whole career, and let me tell you, training and coaching on your own, it can be incredibly rewarding, but it can also be a bit lonely and stressful sometimes. You're always under pressure to make the right decisions, and you know that the results of this block in many ways depend on you making good choices. Doing it by yourself without any feedback or without any support can be a lot to deal with. You should really consider how the RTS Training Lab can help. It's your ultimate support system. It's designed to help you make better training decisions for yourself and for your athletes. That's writing better programs. That's better monitoring of athlete progress, that's better block analysis, that's better communication. You can get inspiration from our absolutely humongous program library. Like seriously, there's hundreds of unique programs in there, along with tools to help you sort through all of it and find just the right one. Then you can deploy that program or use it as inspiration to build your own via our program builder. Then you use advanced reporting tools to more fully understand the training trends for yourself and your athletes. But that's just the beginning. Our private community is staffed with top-notch coaches and experts in biomechanics, nutrition, injury rehab, sports psychology, and more. These experts host events that are already on the books at a wide variety of times to fit your time zone. There's no need for any appointment. You just hop in and get expert advice for no additional charges. Whether you need programming ideas, injury advice, mental coaching, we got you covered. This isn't about having tools. This is about having a team. A team that's there to support you, guide you, help you make the best decisions for your training. And all that's $35 a month. That's right. For the cost of like a couple takeout meals, you get unparalleled access to expert support, advanced training tools, and more. Don't let one more unnecessarily mediocre training block pass you by. Go to store.reactivetrainingsystems.com, click on Training Lab in the main menu to learn more. See you there.